I never believed in ghosts. Not really. I always thought abandoned hospitals were just crumbling ruins, nothing more than old brick and shattered glass. Places where the echoes of suffering still lingered, but not in the way horror stories would have you believe. That was before I stepped into St. Alara's asylum, a place where silence itself felt like it had a heartbeat. It started as a dare. Typical, right? My friends, Jake and Lacey, had been talking about exploring it for weeks. The asylum had been shut down for nearly 4 decades after a string of unexplained patient deaths. Some say the doctors were experimenting on the mentally ill, performing procedures that even the most depraved minds wouldn't imagine. Others claimed that whatever happened inside was not human at all. The night we chose was bitterly cold, the kind that seeped into your bones. We parked our car a few blocks away to avoid drawing attention, and as we made our way through the overgrown lot, the hospital loomed before us, a black, hulking silhouette against the moonlight. The windows were jagged, gaping like broken teeth. Every step closer made my stomach tighten, but I refused to let fear win. The entrance was already pried open, the heavy iron door standing slightly ajar as if waiting. "Come on, it's just an old building," Jake muttered, clicking on his flashlight. The dim beam cut through the dust, illuminating faded murals of angels and demons, their once detailed faces now warped and peeling. Lacey shivered beside me. The air inside was wrong, thick, heavy. It smelled of damp rot and something else, something metallic. Blood, number that was impossible. But as we moved deeper into the main hall, I felt an unease settle in my chest, like a weight pressing against my ribs. Then I heard it, a whisper, not from Jake, not from Lacey. It came from the far end of the hallway, where the darkness seemed impossibly dense. A voice, soft and eerie, like someone standing just behind me, breathing words I couldn't understand. I spun around. Nothing. But the air was colder now. And the hallway? It was shorter when we walked in. I swear, it was shorter. Lacey grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" Her voice was barely a whisper. I nodded, my pulse hammering in my throat. The asylum wasn't empty. And we weren't alone. I stood frozen, my breath hitching in my throat. The whisper had been so close, like someone had leaned in just beside my ear. But when I turned, the corridor was empty, just shadows stretching across the peeling walls. "Let's just keep moving," Jake said, his voice lower than before. "It's just the wind. These old buildings make weird noises." I wanted to believe that, I really did. But the air was still, too still. There was no breeze, no shifting of leaves outside, no distant hum of passing cars. Just an eerie, unnatural silence that made the asylum feel like it was holding its breath. We pressed on. The hallway seemed endless, stretching longer than it had when we first entered. The walls bore remnants of a different time. Rusted gurneys overturned, shattered IV stands, and old yellowed patient records scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. The flickering beam of Jake's flashlight landed on something etched into the wall. "Help us." The words were carved deep, jagged, and frantic, as if someone had scratched them with bare fingernails. "Dude, let's get a picture of this," Lacey whispered, reaching for her phone. She snapped a photo, but when she looked at the screen, her face drained of color. "What the hell?" She turned the phone toward us. The image showed more than just the words. There was a figure standing in the hallway behind us. Not just a shadow, not just a trick of the light. A woman. Her hospital gown was torn, stained with something dark, and her face was blurred, distorted like a scream caught mid-sound. I spun around. Nothing. The hallway was just as empty as before. But now I felt it. Something was watching us. "Let's just keep moving," Jake muttered, his voice tense. "We'll check out the patient rooms, then get the hell out of here." I nodded, though my hands were slick with sweat. Every fiber of my being told me to turn back, to leave before something we couldn't explain decided we weren't just passing through. We pushed open the door to the first patient ward. The hinges screamed in protest. The room was lined with rusted bed frames, their mattresses torn apart as if something had clawed through them. Some beds still had restraints, their leather straps cracked and curling with age. "This place is straight out of a nightmare," Lacey murmured, sweeping her flashlight across the room. Then the beam landed on the wheelchair. It sat in the farthest corner, facing the wall. Something about it made my skin crawl. The wheels were covered in grime, but the seat cushion, it looked untouched, like someone had just been sitting there. Jake, ever the fearless idiot, walked toward it. "I bet it belonged to one of the last patients," he mused, brushing his hand against the armrest. Then the chair moved. Not a slow, gentle shift. It jerked backward, hard, as if someone had just pushed off the ground to stand up. Jake stumbled back, cursing. "What the hell?" And then we heard it, a loud, metallic clang from behind us. Lacey screamed. I whipped round just in time to see one of the rusted bed frames sliding across the floor by itself. Something was here. I grabbed Jake's arm. "We need to go. Now." But before we could move, the fluorescent light overhead, which hadn't worked in decades, flickered to life with a sickly buzzing hum. And in that brief flickering moment, I saw them. Figures, standing between the beds, pale, hollow-eyed, staring, and then darkness. The light snapped off, plunging us back into blackness. A whisper, inches from my ear. "You shouldn't be here." The whisper was right beside me. Cold breath brushed against my ear, and every hair on my body stood on end, my muscles locked up, my brain screaming at me to run, but my feet refused to move. Then, a hand. Ice-cold fingers gripped my wrist. I jerked away with a strangled gasp, stumbling backward into Lacey. She barely caught me before we both hit the floor. Jake swung his flashlight wildly around the room, his breathing sharp and uneven. But there was no one there. Nothing but overturned beds and the rotting stench of something long dead. "Did you feel that?" I gasped, clutching my wrist. Even in the dim light, I could see the skin. A faint imprint of fingers. "We need to leave," Lacey whispered. "Now." Jake hesitated. "But the stories, they say the worst happens when you try to leave." I swallowed hard. He was right. The legends about St. Hilara's all had one thing in common. The people who ran never made it out. The overhead lights flickered again, buzzing like dying insects. Shadows twisted along the walls, stretching and writhing like something alive. And then the wheelchair moved again. But this time, it didn't just roll. It lifted. Slowly, unnaturally, as if unseen hands were pulling it into the air. The metal frame groaned, trembling violently before it slammed into the ceiling with a deafening crash. Lacey screamed. I grabbed her hand, yanking her toward the door. But just as we reached the threshold, it slammed shut, hard. The sound echoed through the ward like a gunshot. Jake threw his weight against it, twisting the rusted handle with all his strength. "It won't budge," he shouted. Panic clawed at my chest. We were trapped. Something wanted us here. And then we heard it. Footsteps, not ours. Slow, measured, coming from the hallway just beyond the door. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded off, not like normal footsteps. Like something was walking on bare bones. Then a voice, low, rasping, inhuman. "You shouldn't have come." The lights overhead exploded. Shards of glass rained down. And in that split second of darkness, I saw something. A face, pale, hollow-eyed, stretched in a grotesque grin. Not inches from mine. I screamed, stumbling backward. My flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic beams of light across the room. Jake and Lacey were frozen, staring at the doorway in sheer terror, because it was opening. Slowly, as if something on the other side wanted to savor the moment. The hallway beyond was pitch black, and yet movement. A shape crawled into view, not walked, crawled. Its arms were too long, its fingers, twisted, unnatural. The way its joints bent was all wrong. And when it lifted its head, I realized. It had no eyes, just gaping hollow sockets. And it was laughing. A wet, gurgling sound, like air escaping a throat that had been slit. Jake lost it. He grabbed a rusted forepole and swung it at the thing. But the moment it made contact, the creature vanished, like smoke dissipating into the air. The fourth pole clattered to the ground, the sound deafening in the silence. For a heartbeat, none of us moved. Then, bang! The metal doors at the far end of the ward burst open, slamming against the walls with enough force to shake the room. Beyond them lay a hallway we hadn't seen before, one that shouldn't have existed. A single wheelchair sat in the center, and in it, the woman from the photo. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle. Her milky eyes locked onto us. Then she stood, and the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the entire ward, thick and suffocating. My breathing was ragged, my heart beat thunderous in my ears. Somewhere, in the black void ahead, I could hear the soft, unnatural creak of bones shifting. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming toward us. I fumbled for my flashlight, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I clicked it on, nothing. The battery was dead. Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. "Where is she?" Lacey choked out a breath. She was in the chair, but now she's... A giggle. It echoed from every direction, distorted and wrong, like a child's laugh played in reverse. I swallowed hard. "We need to run." Jake gritted his teeth. "Where?" He was right. The door we'd come through was gone. The hallway ahead was wrong, stretching longer than before, twisting in unnatural angles. It was as if the entire hospital was shifting, trapping us inside. Then the temperature plummeted. Our breaths turned to mist. A deep, guttural voice rasped through the darkness. "Stay with us." I grabbed Lacey's wrist and yanked her forward. "Move!" We sprinted down the hallway, the echoes of our footsteps blending with something else. Something chasing us. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it. The hallway twisted, branching into multiple paths that hadn't been there before. Panic surged through me. We were lost. Jake skidded to a stop. Which way? I spun wildly, my eyes darting between the corridors. They all looked the same. Dark, endless, wrong. Then ahead, a flickering light. A doorway, slightly ajar. Beyond it, the faintest glow of the moon. The exit. "There," I shouted, shoving Lacey toward it. She didn't hesitate. Neither did Jake. We bolted forward, the air behind us growing heavier. Then, the scream. Not from us, from it, A horrific, blood-curdling shriek filled with rage and agony. The walls trembled. The floor beneath us cracked. Someone grabbed my ankle. I fell hard, my chin slamming against the cold tile. Pain exploded through my jaw. I twisted onto my back. She was there, the woman. Her face was right above mine. Her skin was stretched tight, her hollow eyes boring into me. She opened her mouth. Wider than any human should, a chorus of whispers poured out. I screamed. Jake grabbed my arm, yanking me up. The woman's fingers raked across my skin, leaving deep, ice-cold burns. We burst through the doorway. The moment we crossed the threshold, everything went silent. The air was warm again. The hospital was gone. We were outside. The building behind us stood perfectly still. The windows were dark, the structure crumbling like it had been abandoned for a century. Jake doubled over, hands on his knees. Lacey sobbed quietly. I turned back, my chest heaving. In the highest window, she stood there, watching, and just before the clouds swallowed the moonlight, she smiled.